Welcome to the Tricord Advisors podcast. I'm Jeremiah Lee, and this is Randy Barkley. We're both certified financial planners, and I'm also a California licensed attorney. This is the show where we answer your questions, and we help give people wisdom and thoughts of how to build the life they love. Today, we're talking about what happens when the emergency happens. We talk so much about building a life and building forward and investments and trying to do all these right steps. But sometimes there's a disaster. Sometimes there's an emergency.
The things you don't plan for, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it just happens.
And what do you need to have in place? Like, what can you plan for, right? Someone getting sick, someone getting injured, losing a job. You can't plan for that event, in the sense that that's going to happen. It's an emergency. It's a disaster. But what can you put in place in your life that avoids some of those massive consequences? I mean, some of the items that folks deal with is when they get big medical bills, it can derail an entire plan.
Yeah, I mean, we see that more often than I'd like. Of course, there's been a long struggle now for the last couple of decades over universal health care and health care benefits and portability and all these things. But at the end of the day, you're responsible to make sure where your health insurance costs are going to come from.
Yeah,
your deductible plans and all those things, right?
Yeah, similar to also if someone loses a job. For some folks, it's a moment of reflection. It's a moment of shift. For others, it's an immediate emergency. There's a statistic that's years ago, so I don't know if it's still accurate. I'm sure they need to update this. But it was something along the lines that 60-70% of Americans couldn't deal with a $1,000 emergency. There's a $1,000 emergency that came up. They couldn't just reach into savings and pay for it and be done. They would have to swipe a credit card, which is going to come back the next month. They have to work overtime. And so that just savings rate was a big deal. So what we're talking about today is a number of ideas of what can you put in place now? What can just be part of your life that helps kind of disaster-proof your life for normal, expectable, potentially emergency. So the first one is probably not a surprise, but it's build an emergency fund.
So what does that mean? I mean, if I'm just starting out in life, let's say I'm 25 years of age, I'm married, I've got a child, and my wife and I are working, and our expenses are pretty much eating up all of our income right now. I mean, if you're renting right now, the cost of rent is just extraordinary. How do I build an emergency fund? I mean, how do I do that?
Yeah, it's tough.
And how much, right?
And the significant point is if you're making ends meet, right? You're trying to take your say 2 working adults, you're trying to cover all your expenses, you're getting month to month. And people will do that and they'll get 3 or 4 months. Hey, we're making it. We're barely making it, but we're making it. And I think a lot of our country candidly lives that way, especially in California where rents are significant, the cost of living are significant. And so people in that boat, what they're not realizing is how close they are to the edge, that if something happens, there's a minor accident in a car, they break a leg, they get sick and can't go to work for a week or two, and we'll just say it's $1,000. Say it's $1,000 expense that's not in the budget, and they can't afford it, and they don't have any emergency funds. Well, their options become, look to family, try and get some debt somewhere, a credit card, a personal loan, something.
Too easy to get.
Right. Oh, yeah. That's another issue of it's too easy to get. But they'll just use the credit card. They swipe a credit card. They deal with the emergency. Well, the next month, that $1,000 shows up on the bill, and if they can't quite pay all of it, they get interest.
Right.
And if they can't pay that, they get it. And that's it starts a slope. And so many households have been ruined, not because it was a $50,000 issue. It was simply $1,000 initially.
Yeah, I mean, going back to your other comment that most households couldn't afford a $1,000 emergency. I mean, it would cause them to go borrow money or beg from their family or whatever. But it's so common that people live to the dollar, live paycheck to paycheck, and if that paycheck is disrupted just a little bit, it terrorizes their life, and then they're playing catch up. They're having have to make more money or they have to borrow more money. And it's just this snowball effect that starts to take place. And having an emergency fund, having money set aside allows you to overcome those small emergencies and be able to go on with your life without having a complete change, right?
And keep them as small emergencies. So, having $1,000 even is a great set aside. We like to have folks to have 3 months. It is a good, look at your normal spending. Say you're spending $5,000 a month or $6,000 a month, to have 3 months of that and set aside.
And that seems like a huge hurdle for most people to have. Let's say $15,000 or $10,000 set aside an emergency fund. But there's a way to get there, and that's what most people kind of need some encouragement and help. But there is a way to get there, right?
Yeah, and that's part of the budgeting process. I always tell people budgets aren't much fun, but budgets really help fine tune your engine.
Right.
fine tune, what you can produce as a household, and then decide where those additional funds need to go. And, filling up an emergency fund, starting to save for a house, starting to save for other things. And part of an emergency fund is it's the first step towards any other fund. Say, someone wants to buy a house someday. Well, start your emergency fund. Once that gets the right amount, just keep going.
Right.
Keep that savings and start saving for a house. And then the moment when you buy the house, you have to decide how much you need to set aside to maintain your emergency fund. But it's the same pool of money. It's the same setting aside and moving forward to live kind of below your means.
But each one has a little different purpose.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
It has a different purpose.
And once you hit the first one, getting $1,000 set aside, then you can move on to the second one. And once you get the second one, you can move on to the third. And for folks who are no longer, making ends meet, but really building their life,
right?
We're no longer thinking about the emergency fund. We're not talking about the, college fund. Those are already set aside. We're talking now about, okay, if you get an opportunity to buy into a business, or if you get an opportunity to buy some really great real estate, do you have those resources readily available? And those are the conversations we tend to have more of. How are we prepared for, growing your life? But it all starts back at day one of protecting yourself from an emergency.
So there's a lot of things that you should not do. And one of the things that you should be very careful of is credit cards.
Yeah.
High interest debt is crippling. It will, like I said, it's a snowball effect, but a lot of people, when I sit down and talk with them, I'm astonished at what kind of balances that they hold, whether it be a couple $1,000s or $20,000, whatever it is. And they say, well, our credit card balance is X. And I went, and the first thing I do is calculate the interest that they're paying on that money. Had they just did better planning, they wouldn't be. I mean, it amounts to thousands of dollars over a short period of time.
Yeah, no, that's right. And there's a big difference between carrying a balance and using a credit card to facilitate your transactions and paying it off every month.
Right.
There's a lot of folks that we work with that use credit cards and they pay them off every month, and that's just how they cycle their spending. And part of it is, fraud protection. Most credit card companies do really good with fraud protection now through their algorithms. Also the ease of tracking.
Right.
There's a lot of software that will work with your credit card company to track and even auto categorize what you're spending.
Right.
So a lot of folks will run their spending through a credit card. And that's great. But the difference is when people carry a balance that they know every month I'm rolling over 20,000.
So they look at their minimum payment. Say, the credit card company is very nice about sending you a notice saying, if you pay X amount of dollars, this is the minimum amount that we'll accept. And that is the worst trap that you can fall into, because you should pay off your balance every single month. There should not be zero. In fact, what my wife and I do, we started this decades ago when we started using credit cards for basic expenses. We created a first and a 15th pay, because when we didn't have credit cards, we would pay all of our bills and we have it twice a month, first and the 15th. So we pay off our credit cards on the 1st and the 15th of every single month, never carrying a balance forward into the following month. It's just a habit we've created, almost 40 years ago, and we haven't repeated it. We haven't stepped in. I mean, I'm just appalled at how much interest these companies charge.
Right. And how quickly it compounds.
Right.
And so say you had a tighter month, so you say, oh, I'll just roll it till next month. Well, that next month, you have not only what you spent in the 2 months, but whatever the interest is. And over time, that's a big deal. And with that, also, avoiding high interest rate, but also too much debt in general. This is, again, a hard one in California, other places as well, but also California, when folks are trying to get into a home. And often I see folks will get themselves kind of right up to the edge, because sometimes there's no other way to do it. They feel,
right.
They have car debt, they have house debt, they have personal credit debt. And in essence, they've committed themselves to a certain amount of income every single month without fail that doesn't go towards food and living. It goes to their debt servicing.
Right.
And if you live a life that's well below that, then when emergencies come, you say, okay, we got to stop our spending, we got to slow things down, and you're able to. But if your debt is, whether it's high interest or just a large mortgage, there's not much flexibility. And in the week to week, it's not a big deal. But imagine you're working and there's a layoff. You get laid off from your job. A lot of folks, it's going to take you 3 months or so to not just find another job to put food on the table, but a next career to say, I want to transition into something as a future for me. And if that 3 month gap, if there's no funds, one, to fund it, but two, if you have this debt that's requiring every month you to start paying large amounts. So with that, there's high interest debt, and there's just too much debt. And how much is too much? That's a good question.
Well, again, for house, if you're going to do a mortgage, what they want to look at is your total debt must not exceed a certain percentage of your adjusted gross income. And typically it's around 30, 33%, somewhere in that neighborhood. They like to see it below 30%.
Yep.
That includes your mortgage and all the expenses of your house on a monthly basis and your credit card debts on top of that.
Yep.
If you exceed that, you typically are going to pay higher interest, which is, again, another issue people get themselves trapped into. Or they're just disqualified. They can't get the loan.
And I think this was back in 2008. People were relying on the banks as the parent in the room.
Right.
They say, "Can I afford this?" The bank said I can afford it, so let's go. Yeah, and that's a good caveat for people to say. Just because the bank authorizes it, just because they approve it, doesn't necessarily mean that maybe you can afford it on a good day, but is it the wisest thing on a what happens if I lose my job? And for folks that we talk to, if you have a robust emergency fund, if you saved money, did some hard work in your budgeting and saved some good money, well, that allows you the freedom to live a little more aggressively, perhaps, to say, if I did get laid off, I know I've got 3 or 4 months of all my debt payments, everything set aside. So I have a free, quote unquote, 3 months to find my next job, to deal with whatever the emergency is. So that's part of that emergency fund, that it allows you to not have your entire life upset by a small emergency, but rather be able to handle it and keep your long-term debt and your long-term structure and your long-term financial goals on track, despite things.
Stay tuned. What we're going to do is continue our conversation about how you balance out your cash flow in your household. We're going to give you some hints on how to make better choices about your cash flow. Welcome back. Jeremiah and I are talking about things that most people try to avoid, and that is budget management, cash flow management within your household. And I think, Jeremiah, I'd like to talk about some stories.
Yeah.
I mean, there's some things that we've got examples of in our personal life, and you've got some examples regarding, like toys, for example. You've got young children.
Yeah. So 2 stories of kind of budgeting as in the larger context. Budgeting's no fun, but budgeting, we talked about in the first episode, it tunes up your finances, the engine of your life, but also allows you to identify those spots where you can do you can do more, you have money. So one was kind of, I guess, even an ego item. We were at a kind of a Goodwill secondhand store making a donation, but we went in and we're kind of looking at things, and we ended up buying a plane for our son. And it was
by the way, the son's 4 years old.
Yeah, he's 4. Yeah, he's a little toy plane. And it was $1, and so it was not an expensive plane, but it was delighted for him. The fun wasn't that the batteries were dead, or that it might have done something back in the past, but it had a plane that little fold out wings, and he and I spent the rest of the day flying things around the house, pretending to make shooting noises at each other as we played, and it was a delight to him, and it just made me realize that there's so much of, I don't know if it's my ego or someone else's ego in buying kids toys, of how much we think, we need to spend, $25 on a toy for a birthday or something, when, you can buy something much cheaper. The other item that was there that I think is just a good item is Nerf guns. Those Nerf guns that shoot the little bullets, they're hard plastic. Once kids get a little older, they don't use them anymore. People tend to donate them. Well, this, Savers is the store, but you go down there, they have a wall full of Nerf guns that talk about a toy that's easy to wipe off and make sure it's clean, and they still work. And so it just made me laugh. It's like, we should go down there and get an arsenal.
So the Nerf gun was probably $25, $30 retail.
Probably.
And you had a whole wall of them down there for how much?
Yeah, a couple of bucks a piece.
Oh my goodness.
And you just pick them all up. And so what does a kid need? So I think there's budgeting, things like that. The other one that is meaningful, I think, to me of budgeting, and the reason I think budgets are so valuable, is I was working years ago at a law firm, and right next door was a Farmer Boys restaurant. And I would go there for lunch, not when I was taking somebody out or it was a lunch I really enjoyed.
It was convenient.
Just when I forgot to pack a lunch. And we got to the end of one of the years, we're going through our budget and we're going through fast food, and I'm looking at things. And it ended up being about $3,000 I had spent at Farm Boys. And my jaw just dropped. I said, that can't be right. So I go back and look at it, and it's like, well, maybe the family, we all went out to like a lunch or something.
It was your lunch.
It was just me on the days I forgot to pack a lunch or didn't otherwise have lunch plans. It was usually like 1 or 2 p.m. when I was just hungry, and had forgotten to eat. And so I go down there and get a lunch. And it just realized, if I just stopped doing that, if I just remember to pack a lunch, I would get $3,000 back. I would get a raise.
You get a $3,000 raise.
That's what it would feel like. And that's after taxes. So that's probably $5,000. Yeah. But it just identified for me a place where I didn't get joy from that money. It wasn't spent on purpose. It wasn't, building towards a future plan. In fact, it probably wasn't healthy for me, but it was something I could eliminate and then use that money and say, okay, well, this is going to build towards, other goals I have in my life.
I mean, again, I think it's discipline, but at the same point in time, it's not like you're building an exercise program that's going to take you 2 hours every day to go.
Yeah.
I mean, you're talking about packing a lunch that takes you maybe less than 5 minutes to kind of put together.
And often my lunches are leftovers from the night before. I
Right.
think a lot of people do that, and that's a real easy way. So kind of in the midst of, talking about budgeting, we're talking about, financial disasters. What are the things, emergencies that hit you that lead you into a financial disaster and derail kind of where you're headed?
Right.
And one of them we talked about a few, but what we're talking about right now is the budget process of when you know where your money's going. If you have an emergency, you can trim appropriately. And with that, with the budget, is also living kind of within your means. To say if something were to happen, $1,000 expense or something that could be catastrophic. If you're living within a fairly tight budget that's lower than what you're making, there's many households who could just spend $1,000 in that month. And it's okay.
Mm-hmm.
It's within, they have enough excess in there. Not everyone does that.
I remember the story listening to John Templeton, and John Templeton has now passed away, but he was a man who started Templeton Funds, an extremely brilliant individual, but very frugal, grew up during the Depression era. And when he and his wife got married, they made a game out of it to see how cheap they could buy furniture. They were brand new married, and they didn't have any money. It was the Depression. Everybody was really, really frugal. They had to be frugal. But they would go to estate sales, they would go to tax sales, and they would look for pieces of furniture. They even got their friends involved. And the competition was, how cheap could you buy something that was usable in their household? And he said, we were buying things for 10 cents. And he said, a lot of that furniture we kept for over 20 years. It was good furniture. There's nothing wrong with it. And he said, and then of course, when he passed away, I mean, many years later, he's one of the most renowned investment individuals historically. I mean, he sold his company for something close to $1 billion, and this was several years ago. I mean, this was decades ago. So again, it's the wealth that people perceive they have, or the pride they build into the purchase. You don't need to have that, and oftentimes it works against you, particularly if you're still trying to build your financial life. Right?
Get on the other side of ego. There's a good comment in a book we read recently that was saying that getting your savings goals are just on the other side of your ego.
Oh my gosh!
Like
yes.
if you just get past, I need a new furniture, or my wife needs a new this, or my kids need a new that, and just get past that a bit, and pick something up that's 10 cents at a used sale, and then hit your savings goal. Man, I mean,
Right.
you're choosing what you value more. So, well, the other piece, we probably don't have time for a whole lot more, but the next one I'm going to want to move to is insurance.
Yeah.
And this is one of those great safety nets that most people have. Not everyone does, and there's a number of different types of insurance. So the first one is generally health insurance. And in our country, with especially in California, they've covered California. They've now passed rules about having to maintain insurance. Most employers offer insurance. There's a number of folks who go without a health insurance.
Yeah,
but,
I mean,
but they acknowledge they're living in a risky position.
They are.
Because if something, the small things, it's not that big a deal. But if something larger happens, medical bills can be catastrophic. So having reasonable health insurance that protects someone is a good first step.
Yeah. And I mean, again, you're saving, going back to that, if there's a deductible amount you should have for emergency funds, something that would cover your deductible in the event something happens. So it depends on whether you have a PPO or an HMO, your deductible will vary from plan to plan. But the other one is other types of insurance. Life insurance is for people that, particularly if they've got debt, you've got both earners and you need both incomes or a single income in order to survive in that household. You better be considering some kind of life insurance.
Yeah, especially places where there's a 2-income household,
right?
And if one income were to stop, the family could no longer live in that home. And you think about someone has a mortgage and they have a house, they're building their life in a good way, and the unexpected and tragic happens. It's tragic for that person, it's tragic for the family, but also now to say we're gonna have to sell the house, we're gonna have to give up on these other dreams. Man, that's a really tough moment. Whereas most folks, when they'll pick up, a term life insurance, even something that's, inexpensive, especially when they're young, they'll pick up some insurance so that in the event something tragic happens, the survivors of that continue on the same path. They say,
Right.
wow, we took this money, we paid off the mortgage, and now we're living off of one salary, but that's okay. We stay in the same house and our expenses have gone down because we're able to use this insurance money. The other ones, we have life insurance. We just talked about health insurance, disability insurance, or even someone's business interruption insurance.
Yeah.
Those are the, no one's died. It's just you had a moment.
Yeah.
You had a
Replacement of income.
Yeah. You had a moment where your income has fallen off either because you can't work or your business can't operate. I don't see this as common, but super valuable.
And I think that a lot of benefits, employer benefits that provide to their employees, they'll have built in some kind of disability.
Yeah.
And you actually, out of your payroll, you have the state disability is taken out of that. So you have some measure of disability if you're on W-2 income. But companies will offer additional benefits, and it's very inexpensive. Typically, there's no underwriting requirements for it. And it just replaces your income for a certain period of time, typically half a year to maybe a few years.
Yep.
But it's pretty important to have that in case something happens, right?
Yep. The other item as people are building their life is umbrella insurance. And this is one that I always tell people it's the most bang for your buck. But basically you have, homeowners insurance or renters insurance and auto insurance. And they have certain limits, maybe your auto's $250,000. Well, on top of that, as an umbrella goes these umbrella policies, and they don't kick in until after your auto or home is fully paid out, and
the benefits are exhausted,
yeah.
or the insurance is exhausted. Yeah.
But it's this piece on top that says, okay, if you have, you're driving, you have a $1 million liability, this will kick in and cover that. And it's very low premiums because it's secondary insurance, but it's a great safety net for folks.
Yeah, and I think that another one we want to talk about is the kind of insurance that you can buy. Again, you want to evaluate all your insurance costs, and the biggest one is deductible, as I see it. That's where I find people have standard deductibles, like $100 deductible for collision, $50 or $0 deductible for comprehensive. Raise those deductibles up. Talk to your insurance agent and see what kind of discounts that you can apply within your insurance. And that's just monitoring the benefits. But the chances of you having an accident every 5 years is pretty small.
Yeah.
So raise those deductibles up so that you can get a lower premium cost, right?
Yep, that's good. Well, we've been talking about things that will help avoid the disasters when the emergency hits. So if you missed any part of this episode, you can catch us on YouTube, or you can find us on our website, which is tricoreadvisors.com.
Till next week, folks, may you grow in wisdom and knowledge. Thank you for listening.